Welcome to the debate. Imagine tomorrow your organization is moving all of its core operational systems to the cloud,
Oh boy.
right? We are talking about a massive, multi-million dollar enterprise-wide transformation.
A huge undertaking.
Exactly. So you are an executive sitting in the boardroom, reviewing the final launch protocols, and suddenly the CEO turns, looks around the table, and asks a very simple question. Are we 100% sure where our most critical customer data is traveling in this new system?
And, if the evidence to answer that isn't immediately available right there in the room, the answer is already no.
Completely. It is a hard no. So today, Supa, we are launching a specific conceptual channel for this discussion that we call Governance Root.
I love this concept.
Yeah, our focus here is to unpack a critical reality for C-level leaders. The chronic, massive operational failures you experience during these transformations, they are not technical IT issues.
Not at all. They transcend the IT department entirely.
Right, they are deeply rooted at the governance level. So we're dissecting the imperative to govern data flows end to end, focusing specifically on, why governance inefficiency collapses and how organizations fundamentally lose their grip on information.
Yeah, and we've got some strong, differing views on the actual root cause here.
We definitely do. My position on this, Supa, is that the true root cause of this governance inefficiency is a structural lack of formal data ownership. Specifically, it's the failure to explicitly name individuals who are held accountable across the entire life cycle of the data.
And I will argue that the deeper root cause is actually found in leadership habits. Specifically, executives who habitually accept narrative summary reports instead of demanding verified operating evidence of data quality.
Well, let's break down the mechanics of the structural gap first, because I think it's foundational.
Sure, go ahead, Fut.
If you are an executive listening to this, look at your IT budget. You are likely bleeding millions in hidden, decentralized costs. Because, most mature organizations today actually know exactly where their data is stored.
Yeah, the physical location isn't the mystery anymore.
Exactly. If you ask your chief information officer, they can point to the specific physical servers. They know exactly which cloud infrastructure provider they are contracted with, and they have an inventory of the applications.
Right, they have the geography of the data mapped out.
Mapped out perfectly. But what is entirely missing is the accountability for the meaning, the quality, the use, and the protection of that critical data.
And that's where the wheels fall off.
Yeah. We lack a named structural owner who can stand up in that boardroom and explain exactly what a specific data field represents, whether its current value is accurate, and precisely who is authorized to alter it across its entire life cycle.
Well, I come at it from a different way, Foot.
Okay, lay it on me.
You can design a flawless, beautifully mapped ownership structure on paper. You can have an entire matrix of names and titles explicitly defining who owns what.
Which is essential.
Essential in theory, maybe. But that structure is completely meaningless if the board's behavior doesn't change. The gap we are seeing in governance efficiency is not sitting at the operational level, where a name might be missing on a document.
You don't think so?
No, it is a deeply ingrained behavioral habit at the very top of the organization. Leadership constantly reviews project plans, they review strategic intent, and they review high-level dashboards.
Right, the executive summaries?
Exactly. But they rarely, if ever, require actual operating evidence of data integrity before committing massive financial resources to a project.
I see why you think that, but
Wait, just to finish the thought. If the board is perfectly happy to accept a dashboard with green status indicators, a comforting narrative that everything is fine, without ever looking under the hood to see if the underlying information actually supports reliable decisions, then your beautifully designed governance structure is essentially dead on arrival.
okay, I hear you, but let me give you a different perspective by looking at the immediate downstream consequences of lacking that structural ownership.
All right, let's hear it.
When explicit accountability is absent at the source, every single team downstream inherits ambiguity. Because there is no named owner to definitively resolve what a specific piece of data means or how it should be formatted, those downstream operational teams they quietly resolve the ambiguity in their own siloed ways.
Just to keep their projects moving.
Yeah, exactly, just to hit their deadlines. To make the mechanics of this visceral, let's Let's discard the old simplistic analogies of data flowing like a river.
Oh, thank goodness. The river analogy is so tired.
Right? Ungoverned data is much more like a contaminated supply chain in pharmaceutical manufacturing.
Wait, a pharmaceutical supply chain?
Yeah.
Walk me through how you see that mapping to data flows, Fut.
Think about the strict protocols required to manufacture a life-saving drug. A vendor supplies a chemical compound, the raw ingredient.
Okay.
If the individual receiving that material upstream doesn't explicitly own the accountability for verifying the assay results and purity metrics before logging it into the system, that unverified raw ingredient moves right into the production line.
And nobody catches it?
Nobody catches it. By the time it reaches downstream batch processing, the automated systems just assume the material meets standard purity. The result? You manufacture millions of defective pills, triggering a multi-million-dollar product recall and massive regulatory penalties.
Right, a total disaster.
And in an enterprise data architecture, the exact same mechanism applies. An unverified customer classification or an altered financial metric entered upstream without an accountable owner acts as that contaminated ingredient.
It just flows right through.
It flows through the APIs, enters the data warehouse, and ultimately lands on the desk of an executive making a high-stakes strategic decision.
Ah, I see.
Having a named owner at the source of that data prevents this downstream contamination. Why? Because someone is explicitly, structurally accountable for the quality of the asset before it is allowed to move through the enterprise supply chain.
The supply chain contamination analogy perfectly illustrates the severity of the downstream impact, Fut.
I'll give you that.
Thank you.
A single bad input creates catastrophic downstream failure. But we have to examine how your proposed solution, actually naming an owner, plays out in the reality of corporate environments.
It creates accountability.
In practice, naming a data owner usually devolves into a superficial, one-time documentation exercise. A one-time exercise? I am talking about structural accountability, Supa, not a theoretical exercise.
But the reality of implementation is often entirely theoretical. What actually happens is that at the kickoff of a major cloud migration, or, a big data initiative, a project manager demands that a data owner be assigned.
Right, to satisfy the requirement.
Exactly. So someone from the business side, perhaps a VP of sales or a director of operations, gets their name typed into a sprawling spreadsheet.
Okay.
That spreadsheet gets uploaded to a shared enterprise drive, a box is checked on the project charter, and the entire concept of ownership is immediately forgotten.
Well, that's just poor execution.
But it's what happens. The title of data owner is bestowed, but absolutely zero behavioral change occurs in how that data is managed day to day. This is exactly why I point to leadership habits as the true root cause.
But if they had the structure...
Without the board actively changing their routine, without them slamming their hand on the table and saying, show me the systemic proof that this data is clean, governed, and actively monitored today, those titles mean absolutely nothing. They are just dormant names on a forgotten spreadsheet.
That's an interesting point, though I would frame it differently. The spreadsheet only goes dormant because the financial consequences of that ungoverned data are kept hidden from the executives.
Hidden how?
If you want to prompt immediate executive reflection and break that habit you're talking about, you have to expose the hidden costs. Let's look at a model illustrating the costs of ungoverned data.
Okay, let's look at the numbers.
And to be clear to our listeners, these are illustrative figures to demonstrate the scale and mechanics of the problem, not rigid industry benchmarks.
Right, just a model.
But imagine an enterprise facing a $3.8 million annual exposure purely due to hidden data governance failures.
Wow. $3.8 million of operational bleed is going to get any CFO's attention. How does the model break down that exposure?
The majority of it, $2.7 million in this illustrative model, comes directly from regulatory findings caused by data governance gaps.
Oh, compliance fines.
Exactly. This isn't theoretical. This happens when a regulatory body audits your organization and asks for the chain of custody for sensitive consumer data.
And they can't produce it?
Right, because you lack an end-to-end ownership structure, nobody can answer the regulator's query with verifiable evidence. You are fined for failing to meet usage and protection obligations.
That's a heavy hit.
And it gets worse. On top of that massive fine, the model identifies $440,000 wasted purely on data quality rework.
Just fixing mistakes.
Capital spent paying analysts and data scientists to manually correct business decisions that were built on inaccurate, contaminated data and tracking that effort after the fact. Supa, if we had named accountable owners at the point of origin actively enforcing the data's integrity, the mechanisms generating these specific, massive costs would be instantly short-circuited.
I am not convinced by that line of reasoning, because you are assuming the owner has the enterprise-wide authority to prevent the failure.
Well, they should.
But let me zero in on another crucial illustrative figure from that exact same model you brought up.
Go ahead.
You also have a $380,000 cost specifically attributed to migration failure resulting from undocumented data lineage.
Yes, the IT side of the cost.
Right. This is what happens when a company tries to migrate legacy systems to the cloud and the engineering team suddenly uncovers a massive web of undocumented database dependencies, forcing a complete halt and rescoping of the multi-million-dollar project.
Exactly, Supa. Undocumented lineage is a textbook symptom of failing to govern data flows end-to-end. Nobody owned the map of how the systems interacted.
But let's look at the actual mechanism of that failure foot. That migration doesn't crash simply because the board forgot to put a person's name on a lineage document.
Why does it crash then?
It crashes because leadership allowed fundamentally conflicting data definitions to exist unchecked across the enterprise.
Give me an example.
Okay, imagine the marketing department system defines an active customer as anyone who has opened an email within 30 days.
Sure, standard marketing metric.
But the finance department system defines an active customer strictly as someone who's executed a paid transaction within 30 days.
Ah, yes.
Leadership allowed this definitional discrepancy to fester because they never established a resolution authority, a specific governance board or operational protocol designed to trigger when data schemas clash before the migration project began.
Okay, I see the conflict.
So when the new cloud architecture's APIs attempt to pull and merge these conflicting definitions into a single master database, the validation scripts fail, cascading errors corrupt the tables, and the entire migration grinds to a halt.
It breaks the system.
Completely. Discovering that you need an owner only after the APIs are throwing critical errors reflects a systemic failure of inspection and behavioral enforcement from the top, not just a missing operational label on a column of data.
But hold on, Supa. Your logic there skips a fundamental prerequisite step.
How so?
How can you possibly establish a functional resolution authority, a mechanism to arbitrate the dispute between the marketing and finance definitions, if you haven't identified who actually owns the respective data assets in the first place?
Well,
That scenario you just described is the exact definition of the chaos caused by a lack of data ownership. You cannot arbitrate a property line dispute if no one holds the deed to the properties in question.
You can formally assign a deed to someone, foot. But if the governing body never actually enforces the property lines or monitors the borders, simply possessing the deed doesn't automatically resolve the operational clash.
Okay, to explain why the structure must come first, let's examine the governance maturity self-check. This is a standard framework that helps organizations honestly evaluate their data flow visibility and operational control.
Sure, the maturity scales.
Right. Organizations that score between 0 and 2 on this maturity scale are operating in a state defined as being managed by hope.
Managed by hope. That is a brutal but highly accurate assessment of how many C-suites currently operate.
Isn't it? It means the board is looking at a high-level report, looking at the projected revenue numbers, and simply hoping the underlying data is accurate, because they have no systemic, structural way to prove it.
Just crossing their fingers.
Exactly. And if you look at the mechanics of that maturity check, question 1, the absolute foundational baseline asks, do we have a named owner for every critical data asset, explicitly accountable for its quality, meaning, use, and protection? And is that accountability confirmed and current?
The very first question.
It is the unskippable first step. You cannot build a sophisticated governance system, which requires a maturity score of 5 to 7, without first answering a definitive yes to question 1. The structure is the prerequisite for the behavior.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that the checklist approach actually solves the problem.
It's not a checklist, it's a foundation.
But the inherent flaw in using a maturity self-check as your foundation is that it encourages exactly the static check-the-box mentality that leads to those dormant spreadsheets I mentioned earlier.
I mean, if done poorly, sure.
If we are going to look at global standards to solve a multi-million-dollar governance failure, we need to utilize standards that target the actual root cause. Let's look at ISO IEC 38500, specifically the 2024 revision.
Okay, bringing in ISO standards?
Principle 6 of that standard focuses entirely on human behavior.
Human behavior? In an IT governance standard?
Yes.
Most organizations treat data governance as a purely technical architectural discipline. How does the ISO standard tie human behavior directly to the mechanics of data flows?
It shifts the entire paradigm that the standard explicitly states that the governing body shall ensure that IT policies and practices actively reflect the human and cultural factors affecting the responsible use of data. It dictates that governing data is not fundamentally about architecture, it is about managing human behavior. And if we pair that conceptual framework with ISO IEC 38503 from 2022, we get the exact implementation characteristics for this.
Which are?
The 38503 standard asserts that effective data governance is evidenced by continuous quality monitoring routines.
What do those routines look like in practice, though, outside of the standard's theoretical language?
In a real-world cloud environment, these behavioral routines mean implementing automated data quality gates that constantly monitor the flow of information.
Ah, automated gates.
Right.
When an anomaly occurs, say a sudden spike in incomplete customer profiles being generated, the system doesn't just log the error, it triggers an operational review.
So the board gets involved? Exactly. The board and executive leadership must review these anomaly trends and actively audit the resolution process. Having a static data catalog with names typed into it, which satisfies your question 1, is entirely insufficient to meet this standard.
It's a start, though.
True governance requires leadership to enforce behavioral routines that ensure data quality is continuously maintained and proven, not merely assumed because a name is on a list.
I completely agree that a static catalog gathering dust on a server is a useless artifact. We are on the same page there.
Good.
But you actually fix this human behavior to stop operational teams from quietly sweeping data quality issues under the rug to meet arbitrary project deadlines. Leaders must physically map out exactly where critical data travels.
And how do they enforce that?
They need to force these behavioral changes through strict, highly visible, end-to-end ownership structures before any resources or budget are committed to the migration.
So we're back to structure.
You cannot manage human behavior in a void, Supa. You make the enterprise's expectation visible and enforceable by clearly defining exactly who is structurally accountable for every single node in that supply chain.
But Foot, as long as the board of directors is perfectly satisfied with receiving summary reports instead of demanding deep, verified data quality evidence, things like the actual issue resolution trends, the API failure rates, or confirmation that the continuous ownership routines are actively functioning, employees will continue to do the bare minimum required to get the project approved.
Well, sure, human nature.
Human behavior in a corporate setting is deeply pragmatic. The enterprise culture takes its cue entirely from what leadership actively inspects, not what leadership passively expects.
I agree with that.
We have to force a transition from narrative-based management, where a well-written executive summary is enough to secure funding, to strictly evidence-based management, where funding is contingent on proving the integrity of the underlying data flows.
Let me corner this argument with a very practical scenario, Supa.
Okay, let's hear it.
Let's assume you win this conceptual point. Let's say the board has an awakening today. They realize they've been managed by hope, and they decide they are going to radically change their behavior.
A miracle happens.
Right. Tomorrow morning, they walk into the boardroom and they demand exactly this deep, verified operating evidence you are talking about.
Excellent.
They refuse to look at the green dashboard. They want the detailed issue trends. They want the specific data quality metrics for the entire cloud migration. My question to you is, who do they actually ask to provide this?
Well, in the absence of a designated owner, they would have to ask the various operational teams managing the different project streams.
Exactly. And without a named structural end-to-end owner, without that specific designated individual demanded by question 1 of the maturity check, what happens mechanically in that moment?
There would be some confusion.
Everyone in those operational teams will immediately start pointing fingers at someone else to avoid the liability.
Right.
Marketing will say that IT configured the analytics dashboard incorrectly. IT will say that finance provided corrupted source tables. Finance will argue that the data was already non-compliant when it left marketing CRM. It becomes an endless, vicious cycle of deflected responsibility.
The classic corporate runaround.
Exactly. The structure, the explicit named ownership, is exactly what gives the board a functional button to push. It locks in the accountability so that when the board finally changes its behavior and demands evidence, there's an established mechanism and a specific individual required to respond to them.
That is a compelling argument, Fut, and I will acknowledge the operational validity of that scenario.
Thank you.
If you don't have an explicitly designated person, the board's sudden demand for rigorous evidence simply dissipates into the organizational ether. The finger-pointing you described is a very real, very costly corporate reality.
It happens every day.
The structure absolutely provides the board with a target. However, my insistence remains that relying on the structure alone provides a false sense of security.
How so?
We see it all the time. A catastrophic event finally reaches the enterprise level. Perhaps a critical analytics project reveals there is no trusted single source of truth for revenue because there are multiple databases with conflicting values.
Which brings down the whole operation.
Right. Your structure might give the CEO a specific person to yell at when the failure happens, but only rigorous, habitual, continuous inspection by leadership prevents those conflicting values from forming and cascading in the first place.
Well, we are definitely circling the exact same core truth from two highly complementary angles.
We are.
Let me summarize where my perspective lands as we draw this debate to a close.
Sounds good.
If an organization wants to eliminate the massive operational ambiguity that cascades through its departments, and if it wants to stop hemorrhaging capital on hidden costs, like those multi-million-dollar regulatory fines and the continuous cycle of data rework, it must begin by establishing a concrete end-to-end data ownership structure.
Right.
Identifying named, explicitly accountable owners for the meaning, quality, and protection of every critical data asset is the mandatory first step. Without that structural foundation, you are simply managing your enterprise by hope.
And to summarize my perspective, while structural ownership is practically necessary to provide accountability, it remains an empty shell without a pervasive spirit of inspection.
The behavioral side.
Exactly. The ultimate sustainable fix for governance efficiency requires a profound cultural shift at the very top of the organization. Leadership must move definitively away from narrative-based acceptance, the habit of just nodding at green dashboards and well-crafted summary reports, and begin demanding verified, evidence-based execution driven by continuous quality monitoring routines.
What is absolutely clear from both of our positions and where we entirely converge today is that this is fundamentally a governance root issue.
Absolutely.
The inability to track and trust critical data completely transcends the technical purview of the IT department.
Cloud migration fails due to conflicting data definitions. It is not a technology failure. It is a profound organizational governance failure.
To wrap up today's rigorous discussion, I want to leave our listeners, particularly the C-level executives navigating these massive transformations, with a final scenario to ponder.
Leave them with a challenge.
Exactly. When you are sitting in that boardroom tomorrow morning facing a critical strategic decision based on a complex business report, ask yourself, does your organization have the verified, reliable evidence of that data's entire operational trail ready to present to you immediately? Or will your teams have to buy time, scramble, and point fingers to search for the truth?
That really is the multi-million-dollar question, isn't it?
It certainly is. Thank you for pushing the boundaries of this topic, Supa.
Thanks, Food.
And thank you all for joining us on this edition of The Debate.